articulation is a part of clarinet technique that is often not separated from everything else and worked on independently, at least for the younger students. I think it's also one of the most common sources of performance anxiety for clarinet players. Often, we as students don't think about it enough until some piece of repertoire comes around that requires for fast moving notes that are articulated, and then the entire complexity of the issue has to be dealt with all at once. The approach to studying tonguing, which is how we produce articulation, needs to be separated from technique to some degree and worked on independently as much as any other aspect of technique, such as scales and arpeggios for the fingers and the voicing and everything else. I chose to go on directly to articulation rather than to deal with some other things that are an important part of articulation, because there is so much misunderstanding about some aspects of it. Again, my approach is based on what I studied with my teachers over the years, particularly Mr. Marcellus, and it is based on his approach, which was basically to learn how to produce an excellent sounding, tongue-stopped, very short staccato note from which all the other types of articulation grow. There are certainly many other approaches that are equally valid, but the tendency today not to even use stopped articulation is something that's pretty common. In all parts of the orchestral world, it seems like shorter notes are less common than they used to be. And whether one chooses in the long run to ever use the stopped articulation, it's a real handy thing in many ways to be able to use when you need it, and it adds immeasurably to your technical arsenal. So that is the basis for this series. The most often asked orchestral excerpt is the Scherzo from Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream. And as an aspiring clarinet player, or as a professional clarinet player, if you're not able to execute at a reasonable tempo, in this case, I've set the metronome to 82, which I think is a very good tempo for behind the screen at an audition. You have to be able to cleanly and clearly produce this piece of music repeatedly. Really comes down to being able to do that repeatedly, time after time after time, and the second clarinet part as well, usually when needed. 82 sounds like a slow tempo to some of you. You will need to be able to play it faster, but that's a pretty good initial tempo at an audition. That's another subject, though. The goal of this series of videos is to be able to produce the skeleton of that. Hopefully, if you subscribe to all the things I recommend, you will be able to, at some point down the road, let's just put it at 41, which is half of that tempo, and produce exactly the same thing, sounding something close to this. lot that goes into that execution, and that will be the series that follows it. Generally speaking, when studying tonguing, articulation, the quality is the most important thing. The quality of the notes produced. Secondly, the coordination between the tongue and the fingers, and only lastly, speed. Speed is a factor mostly of nature, and the only thing I can tell you is the technique that I use and how to practice it. And then the speed, you will get to whatever your natural speed is. As someone who's not currently in the playing part of the music profession, I also have to say that it seems to me for student clarinet players who are aspiring to perform professionally that double tonguing is nearly mandatory for the modern clarinet player. And that is not something that I can explain and will have to be dealt with separately by somebody else. But I highly recommend that you look into it and become familiar with that technique. I did a series before this on the Airstream. If you have not worked on all aspects of your Airstream, you will struggle with everything in this video. It is all based on the idea that the articulated sound, the staccato sound, is a sampling of the middle of the sustained sound. And in order to produce that, the Airstream must be produced the same way you produce a slurred or long tone production. And the articulation is a subset of that. So if your Airstream is not consistently supported and produced, none of this will work very well. So we move on to other subjects within the realm of articulation, and we'll try to give you exercises that will allow you to build up the stamina and strength and to get the right sound to be able to execute these things.